You know what time it is. It's hot takes time, right on the heels of a patch that, let's say, did not deliver up to the level of community expectations. Random locations are more of an influence on your win or loss than is the meta. This is the kind of thing that's like half true and half not true, because in a specific game, that is going to be 100% true. A random location in a specific game is going to be way more influential on that game than the meta, than the matchup. And I think that is a correct read to actually make. Like, if you get the right locations for your deck, you can win all sorts of bad matchups. Anything that allows you a prominent advantage. Shuri's Lab, if you're a Kitty Pryde deck, is an example of the kind of thing that can make every matchup be favorable to you just because of the numbers that Kitty Pryde can reach in a deck like that. Decks that have, various upside like Move, where there is an Asteroid M, things like that. Like, yeah, in an individual game, the location variance in Marvel Snap is by far more influential, or can be, has the ability to be more influential than the meta game, than the specific deck choices that you made. But over a large sample size, all that stuff starts to even out. So the more you play a game where you win because of a location, or a game where your opponent wins because of a location, or, the majority, games where locations are minorly impactful, but really the matchups between the deck matters. On an individual level, you can absolutely be correct in saying locations can matter more than the matchup. But on an aggregate level, over a conversation about multiple hundreds or thousands of games, your matchups will matter. The metagame will matter. The decisions you made before actually playing the game will matter. And that's where I think people get a little bit confused, because when people say stuff like this, it is true in the one instance of the game. There are going to be a million different games where you can say, I lost because of this location. But there are also going to be things you could have done better before the game. Like, in the aggregate, you're not going to be losing enough because of locations, or contrapositively, winning enough because of locations to offset a poor deck choice over a long enough sample size. And so ultimately, while locations do matter, the variance sort of evens out. Your opponent is going to win some games because of locations. You're going to win some games because of locations. There's going to be some games where locations don't matter. What matters is not... I think there's a really interesting saying that I learned in Magic the Gathering, which is like, 25% of the time, you win no matter what you do. 25% of the time, you lose no matter what you do. And skill is found in the remaining 50% of those games. And how many of those where there's actually decisions that really matter start really, mattering. How you are able to express yourself in those games. And I think that is true across most card games. There are going to be games where there was nothing you could do. You couldn't do anything. And even in Marvel Snap, there are going to be games where, even though you have the ability to retreat, it's maybe mathematically correct not to, and you should stay in, and you lose, and that feels bad. And that's okay. That's part of what makes card games great. Because if there weren't those 25% of games where you could just win for free, you would never beat anyone better than you. And the fundamental promise of card games is that, yes, strategy matters and skill matters, but so does luck. And managing those situations with the snap and retreat mechanic, and understanding how advantageous locations can be to you, that's also a skill. In the same way that managing RNG is a skill, or to go to a sort of larger life context thing, it's a skill the same way, I don't know, day trading is a skill. Like, you're managing risk. You can be a better... you are fundamentally engaging with a random-ish situation in a way that you are given control to manage that risk, and some people can be better at it than others, and that is sort of where the skill of it actually is. And I think it's easy to get sucked in to looking at one instance and saying, well, I couldn't have done anything here, I was always going to lose. And it's like, yeah, there's probably a lot of those, but there's just as many of them happening to your opponents. And the better a deck you play, the more of those free wins that you're going to get. Proxima is way too efficient with Goon Knight. You know what? This is an excellent point. I am operating a new government department called DOGE, the Department of Goon Efficiency. And we're here to investigate whether or not Proxima Midnight is just too efficient a payoff for gooning. I'm sorry. What I actually mean to say is I think Proxima Midnight is actually a pretty good example of exactly how much free power you can be allowed to get. Like, Proxima Midnight has never been busted, never been absurd, just usually been like a pretty good card, a good enough card. Her requirements are strict enough and hard enough to access that you really do have to make deck building concessions in order to make her make sense. Either be playing a full discard deck and Modoc her, or be playing a deck without other cards that can actually get targeted by a Moon Knight and get her out that way. I think she's actually an example of this is exactly how much free power you can give with that level of restriction. And that is actually a good thing, not a bad thing, that they figured that out. I think that's helpful. I think it's like good to know, like, okay, we can give them like a free 7 and it won't be super busted if they just have to go through enough hoops to actually make that happen. Because I think if you told me, hey, you can have as much as 7 free power for jumping through these hoops, a lot of the time I'd be like, oh my god, yes, that's got to be busted. It's got to be insane. And I think it's interesting that it's not. Like, I don't consider Proxima Midnight too efficient. It's not too good. It's like a high roll that lets Moon Knight compete with other mid-range strategies. Like, it's what lets it compete with anti-venom stuff. And I think that's really interesting. The fact that, like, that is actually, it seems to be the about the amount of power that they can give you for free as long as there's significant hoops to jump through. I think Anti-Venom's actually an interesting comparison because it's like, it's a 4/7, it pairs with Loot Cage, it gives you some power for free if you have the Loot Cage. Like, there is something to that idea where it's like, I think if you had me ballpark the exact amount of power it's okay to get for free if you, like, perform some other game actions, I would say it is 7. People need to stop crying about Arishem. He's good, but not OP. The RNG usually is in favor of the opponent, and he's good for the new player base. They get cards they probably don't have. And then 6 seconds before that, even though they tell us Arishem has an acceptable win percentage, he's still the worst thing to play against and should keep being made worse. Boy, the duality of man. So my take on Arishem, I've probably said it a million times, we're not going to spend much time on this one because you probably know what it is at this point. I think the card is fine. I would be fine if they nerfed it based on just, like, it being annoying. I'm generally fine on them nerfing stuff based on it being annoying, and Arishem has a massive amount of negative player sentiment attached to it. I personally believe that a lot of that negative player sentiment has been so hyperbolic and overblown that it has negatively polarized me the other direction. I see people saying stuff that is just sort of not true about Arishem. It removes all skill from the game. There's nothing you can do about it. None of that stuff is stuff I believe to be true, and when people talk in massive hyperbole, I tend to take the other side almost reflexively because it's like, okay, if you're not making a good argument, I can't actually begin to even side with you. All I can do in my brain is start poking at the reasons why that's a bad argument. And so I've been sort of negatively polarized against the Arishem complainers because I haven't seen a lot of truly compelling arguments other than he's really annoying, which, to be clear, he's really annoying, super compelling argument. I buy it, not going to argue with anyone about that. So generally speaking, I do not consider it overpowered, but I would not complain if they nerfed it. I think I would probably be happy if they nerfed it, if only because then I could stop reading the complaints, maybe. I love this game, but I can't seriously recommend it to others. The card acquisition system is the main issue. It's expensive, overwhelming, and hard to keep up with. It's such a shame that a game I enjoy so much feels inaccessible for newer casual players. I think this is ultimately the problem that Marvel Snap is going to have to reckon with. If I were to say that they had an existential problem, this is the existential problem. It's hard to recommend anyone play this game because of how hard it is to build up a collection in this game in the ways that people in the sort of TCG customer base are accustomed to doing. You can't do all of the things in this game that you can do in every other game. I know when I played Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, for example, it was mid-2024. I got a Sword Soul deck for free, and as far as I could tell, Sword Soul had been, like, relatively power crept out of the meta, but it was a deck that had won Worlds the year before, or come second place in Worlds the year before, and I just got that for free. I didn't get a bunch of other stuff. I didn't get to explore the depth of the game, but I was able to have a deck that I could play at the highest levels. And I think that's the kind of thing that TCG players are accustomed to. They're accustomed to saying, like, look, I want to dip my toe in as a gamer, as a competitor, and see what that's like. And I think ultimately, when I look at all of the decisions Second Dinner has made, they have made a concrete decision that they don't want to appeal to that demographic of players. They don't want to be the next versus system or whatever that peels off players from Magic with competitive gameplay and then is unable to sustain that ecosystem. They don't want competitive players because competitive players are motivated by value propositions. And as soon as the value prop on the game becomes negative, they'll go over to the next game. And I think that has sort of caused a conflict between the type of people that watch my content, competitive-ish players, oriented at least, and the general idea that Second Dinner has for what their game is and should be. I don't think they want it to be what people who watch my content want it to be. And one of the costs of that, and I think one of the largest costs of that, is a lack of easy access to a small portion of the final metagame. And what I mean by that is there's no budget deck that you can take and climb up the ladder and compete at high infinite with. That's not real. Because of the way cards are produced in this game, it probably can never be real. It will always take time. You can't just show up, spend $100 on, it's not the best deck, it's not the second best deck, it's not the third best deck, not the fourth best deck, not the fifth best deck, not the sixth best deck, like the 7th to 10th best deck, just a deck that people play. You can't go do that in this game. And I think there is a certain type of player for whom that is the only way they interact with new games. They interact with new games by saying, I would like to, just have an actual meta deck and not just like a pile of cards that doesn't make sense. And Marvel Snap does not give you the ability to do that. And I think that is ultimately a decision that while I understand that it might not be the best idea on a like consistent basis to like appeal to competitive players, I do think that specific aspect of it appealed to far more than competitive players. When I was going to Friday Night Magics more than a decade ago, I was spending $60 on a budget deck that probably sucked, but it was a deck and it had an ethos. It was a cohesive collection of cards that could actually win games. It meant something to me that I had that I was able to do that. And building up my collection through making budget decks is really important to me. And that I can't do that in Marvel Snap. And basically what I'm getting at is the way I engaged with every other game is not available to me in this game. And that makes it hard to recommend to other people who engage with games the same way. I've agreed with the negative feelings about acquisition, but then I sorted my deck and I realized I'm only missing 8 cards. 2 good, 5 niche, and 1 Hercules. I'm a season pass buyer and that's it. I guess maybe it's not actually that bad. The thing about this situation is I don't have all the information here, but I would guess they've been playing for a while. And I think, yes, if you are a season pass buyer and you've been playing for a while, you can have basically everything you want. But the issue is you have to have been playing for a while, a long while. I would guess that this person has an account that is more than 1, possibly 2 years old. And that is an awkward situation to put your player base in, where it's like, yeah, eventually you'll get everything. You just spend your $10 a month, you'll catch up, it'll be fine. That is, I think, basically true. It's just there's no way to get started in that same way. Marvel Snap's economics have always been weird to me because it feels like you're just never supposed to buy anything other than the season pass. When you look at like the actual value compared to it, like the way this person is approaching the game is the objective right way to approach the game. And that's actually part of what makes it so hard to recommend, because it's like, okay, You should start playing Marvel Snap. Just spend $10 every month, and in 2 years, you can play whatever you want. That's not a good pitch. My take. Card acquisition and ownership in Snap is way better compared to the booster pack reliance of Pokemon Pocket, Shadowverse, Duel Links, MTG Arena, and Hearthstone with their card set rotations. I think this is a tough one because I think that at some point Marvel Snap will come to the point where it might need a rotation, and I have no idea how they're supposed to manage that if they ever want to not piss people off, because it seems basically impossible the way they've set up the economy. The reason I say that is because there's really only 2 ways to go when you're making cards and you want them to be new and exciting and push boundaries and be good. You don't want to make a card that isn't good, right? If you made a card that isn't good, well, no one's going to go out and buy it with Marvel Snap system. So you probably don't want to do that, which means you probably want to make cards that are good and interesting and appealing. And the more of those you make, the harder it is to make cards that are good and interesting and appealing because you've made so many. And so now the bar is higher. And so now you're making cards that are good and interesting and appealing, and they are compared to the context of now, but compared to the context of 2 years ago, they're way beyond the pale. And I think that that is basically inevitable, and there are really only 2 ways to deal with it. And the first is to just keep doing it, and the second is to artificially pare power back. I think the reason we even have a term for the word like power creep is because it is an inevitable function of how every card game's economy works. If you don't make cards better than the previous cards, people won't buy them. They will use what they have. This is very basic. And so in some way, they have to do it. And we've seen this across years of Magic the Gathering, where it's like a card now, any common now, you take that back to like 1993 and you'd blow John Finkel's head off. He'd be like, what the hell is this? Like, this is a known phenomenon across everything. Stuff kind of has to get better. And if you want to draw a line and say, here's where we have to stop, well, that means you need to take stuff out to artificially lower that power level down. Let's say you start at like a 5, and then you gradually power creep up to like an 8. And you're like, I would like to bring it back to a 6. Well, you got to get rid of some of those 7s and 8s that you made. It's the only actual thing you can do. And that's what rotation is. And so while I agree that rotation is not the kind of thing that I want to see in Marvel Snap because of the way they've structured the economy, I really do think there's really only 2 ways this goes. And one is that scale keeps going up further, and the other is they artificially pare it back, and people are mad because they lost their investments. Or not necessarily investments, that might be the wrong word, but they lost their resources that they committed with the promise of this thing not happening. And so I think that ultimately rotation allows for a limit to power creep in a way that not having it does not. And I'm not saying it's a cure-all, because obviously you look at Magic, they have rotation and power creep, right? Like, you can do both. But it does bring it back a little bit. It is a mitigating force on that. And I think that people probably should understand that it is eventually one or the other in every card game. It's not something they do because they want to screw people over. It's something they do so that they're I guess. I mean, I was about to say it's something they do so their business model can be sustainable. If you think of any business model as like, how do we screw people over in a way that keeps them coming back? I guess you could call it that. But I think ultimately, like, if you want the game to exist, it's got to make money. If they want to make money, the cards have to be good and desirable. I guess really what it is the cards have to be desirable, and good is a really easy way of making them desirable. And I find it hard to believe that you could ever create a bunch of cards that are desirable and also not good. So I do think that there is ultimately an inevitable pull this direction that has to be managed by either continuing to go that direction or artificially pairing it back with rotations. Personally, getting tired of all cards that become meta are just ones that drastically boost power. Galacta is the current example. She's the new top card for giving up power freely, so she's in every deck. I want more interesting cards that don't have to deal with only power. This is actually a fundamental Marvel Snap issue, which is they only have two numbers on the cards: how much it costs and how much it gives you. That's it. So everything about the cards is gonna be related to that. Every card will be judged on those two numbers. And then in the text box, they have stuff that modifies those two numbers and changes the context of those two numbers. But it's still just two numbers. And so Marvel Snap is a game about who has the most points. It's always going to be that. It will never not be that. It will be about those numbers in the form of energy cheat, in the form of power gain, in the form of a number that's too big on a card where the other number is too small. That is what the game is. It can't be anything other than that. That is fundamentally what a game where the win condition is having the most points is about. It is about the use of your energy to create the most points. That's it. That's all it's ever going to be. This is part of one of the reasons why I think that Affliction should be a bigger part of the game and Luke Cage should be a smaller part of the game, because Affliction is effectively a third number on those cards, where it allows you to modify your opponent's power in certain ways and adds like dynamic, almost combat to the game. Right now, I don't think that's true because Luke Cage is a one-size-fits-all answer. We'll probably get a little bit into that later. Okay, I actually looked ahead, and I don't think I put the Luke Cage submission on here, so we'll talk about it now. Luke Cage is an issue because I think that Affliction is such an interesting mechanic that can be used in so many different ways. Valentina, Anti-Venom one way, and then the other way is like the Hazmat way or the Bullseye way. But I think it's such an interesting mechanic, but it becomes uninteresting because there's one card that answers it entirely, and that card goes in a lot of those decks, meaning that the smaller investment in the mechanic ends up beating the larger investment in the mechanic. So like if you're only playing like Luke Cage Anti-Venom, you're going to beat the crap out of anyone who's invested further into the Afflict mechanic because you have a Luke Cage and the cards don't do anything. And so my take on Luke Cage is that ultimately I think he needs to be like cut up into like 3 different cards, different kinds of solutions to Affliction, where it's like one happens just at this location, one is like an activate that cleanses across the board, one is like a 5/7 maybe that has Luke Cage's current effect. The point I'm making is that right now there's no dynamism in gameplay when it comes to Afflict, and I think that if you're looking for a third number to go on cards, that's a really good one, and I'm sad that Luke Cage holds it back from being that. Nerf move! It's a high MMR problem because of high skill cap, but with all the new move stuff, Vulture and Dagger need to get reverted. It's way too easy to trigger them now, and they get way too big for their cost. The higher up you are, the more you probably agree with this take. Move is basically the new Loki, is sort of how I think about it. It's super busted if people understand how to play it, but it is devastatingly hard to play. I consider Move Bounce harder to play than Loki ever was, and I didn't think it would ever reach that point. Loki was always a deck that was very difficult to play that I thought was easy. And that is because I have like a baseline understanding of matchups and like when this matters. And like that's the skills that Loki required were not hard skills in this metaphor. They were soft skills. Move requires hard skills, like keeping things ordered in your mind properly and figuring out the proper way in which to do the thing. And then it also requires soft skills, like what to prioritize when. And I think that ultimately, especially Move Bounce, is probably the hardest deck I've ever played, and that's what holds it back in every other rank bracket. But ultimately, I think it's hard for them to justify nerfing a card only for the top players because that's not a huge percentage of the player base. You don't want to do that. You don't want to nerf a card that is struggling for 95% of the player base. You probably want to buff that card. And the fact that it's really good at high level, that's indicative of a kind of a different problem where it's like cards that are good when you're very invested, but not very good for most people. And we've been there before with Loki, and I think that's where we are with Move. Is not enough time to properly evaluate a card and gather data to determine if a card is worth picking up for your collection or not. This is objectively true, and it sucks that the general way in which the content ecosystem operates sort of forces me into giving my weekly verdict. I guess I shouldn't be so mad at the content ecosystem so much as the FOMO method of card distribution in Marvel Snap. I assume that that is roughly on purpose, but I also assume that they want you to figure out that the card is good. Like, they don't want Ajaxes on their hands where I figure out the card is good and very few other people do, and then they're like, oh, I didn't buy Ajax. I feel like such an idiot. And I think they want their cards to be like obviously good and worth picking up. I think their goal is that every card is that. Obviously, that's a hard goal to reach. I do think that people jump the gun on day one a lot more than they should. I just did the episode where I talked about Penny Parker, and there were a bunch of comments that were like, Cam, you convinced me to buy Penny. No, I shouldn't have done that. She wasn't out yet. Go, at least wait until I do a day one dex, dude. Like, don't buy stuff on theory crafting. That's crazy. Like, I'm good at my job, but I'm not psychic. I can't see the future. I'm still just guessing like everyone else. You realize how good the snap mechanic is when you draw Mankey Primeape into Pika EX and your muscle memory wants to smash the snap button. God, that's so true. I can't tell you how many other games I've played where I've been like, why can't I snap? It's such a good mechanic. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for enjoying that video. You like that? I incepted it into thinking you enjoyed that video. I incepted that into your brain. Yeah, you enjoyed that. You liked that, didn't you? Oh, I know you did. As always, I've been KMBest. Remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.